Today we're joined by Torsten Hoffman, who is the producer and director of the new award-winning documentary, Bitcoin, The End of Money as We Know It. Torsten, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
All right, so first things first, what made you decide to make this film?
Well, Bitcoin is a complex topic, and it's hard to get the message across and the whole thing across in just one article that people might read in the New York Times. So I think it's a perfect topic for a TV documentary, and we ended up doing it in 60 minutes. So it's basically a 60-minute crash course into money and Bitcoin.
So, Torsten, this is essentially not just a documentary about Bitcoin, but also about monetary history. How did you decide to kind of approach it this way to take on this topic particularly?
Yeah, that changed. So I wanted to make a film about Bitcoin, but I then, starting to write it, realized that we can't just jump right in. We would lose people. So we just had to start all the way in the beginning with the history of money, the gold coins, the governments that started to collect taxes and clip off those gold coins and things like that, because only then or even inflation. I mean, that's a very important one, obviously, for Bitcoin. So even if people know what the problem is with our fiat money, then they kind of get what the difference is in Bitcoin. So I think that was a learning process for me along the way. And we spent about half of the film talking about money and banks and finance, and the other half about Bitcoin.
One of the things that we always like to ask about guests that are on have something to do with a project directly involving the Bitcoin blockchain is, how did you first discover Bitcoin?
So like many people, I heard about it 2 or 3 times and dismissed it and just kind of shrugged it off and laughed at it. But once I studied a bit more, I think only an hour maybe, it completely caught me. And maybe you guys changed your careers or started a podcast, or some people write a book or blog, and for me it was making a film about it. So similar to many others I think you've probably had on the show.
So what is it that you learned in the process of making this film? Was there any surprises that you learned about Bitcoin or the ecosystem in general?
Yeah, a few things. So I mean, the history of money wasn't really my area of expertise. So I did learn a lot researching that particular part of the story. But in terms of Bitcoin, what I was surprised about, in the beginning people talk about those libertarian ideas and how freedom is so important and all these things. And in the beginning I thought that's kind of bullshit, right? I thought that's it doesn't matter, it's a technology and it's money. And the more I kind of got into this space and talked to more and more people, Roger Ver is a good example, the more I realized how bad an idea it is to have governments or banks in control of our money. So this libertarian or that freedom aspect of it actually does make a lot of sense to me. So that's something I changed my mind about.
So maybe for our listeners who haven't seen the movie yet, and we definitely recommend it, or I would, having seen it, could you explain a little bit sort of why you think the libertarian critique of maybe central banking has some merit, why you think Bitcoin sort of plays a role in that change in monetary history? A little teaser kind of the thrust of the movie, and especially toward monetary theory and history.
Yeah, a few things come to mind. So I think most people don't realize that the Fed is actually not a government agency or like a government department. It's owned by private banks, and that is one thing, and maybe that's bad enough. But if you realize that our money today is created by debt, so that means if the US government goes much more into debt, they sell those bonds, the same banks that own the Fed benefit from having more debt. So basically the whole system is kind of set up to create more and more money, and that of course turns into inflation down the road. So I think that is something we try to have a punchy little paragraph or chapter in our film about, like those charts of how inflation affects money. So that would be one. Another one, let me think. Yeah, like even the idea of how paper money was actually first invented or first came about. It was really about people agreeing that this paper had value because somebody else would exchange it and agree to oh, the person that issues this can be trusted, so therefore his paper has value. And I think that is particularly important if you then later look into Bitcoin and how value is created.
And to further that a little bit, since the documentary is a lot about monetary history and about Bitcoin, obviously, what sources or experts, off-screen or on-screen, did you speak with or consult with to kind of guide where you were going with this?
So many different things. So I mean, I have a big bookshelf behind me, and I kind of studied finance at MBA as well. But we had many top experts on camera and off camera. So economists like Jeffrey Tucker, Roger Ver, and all these kind of Bitcoin gurus, of course. But also some skeptics. And I think, or I hope at least, that this is not too much of a fanboy film. I hope it's not like too one-sided. I mean, obviously I'm a big Bitcoin believer and fan, but for the mainstream audience, I think it's important to also have the other side of the coin, if you will. So there are some people saying, yeah, okay, this Bitcoin thing is an interesting idea, but 1, 2, 3 things to consider here. So we try to keep a balance. It's hard because it's so hard to find people who understand Bitcoin and still criticize it. As you know, it's hard to find those people.
So let's unwrap that just a little bit. It sounds like there are still some critics who may understand it. Was there some sort of merit to the arguments that they had against Bitcoin, or perhaps even a common thread that caused them to oppose Bitcoin, despite the fact that they understood it?
So we have a few of those uneducated critics that say, oh, this is a scam, this is a Ponzi scheme, this is too volatile, And I mean, volatility could be, I guess it has some merit. The criticism of Bitcoin being volatile, you could spin it both ways, right? It's good and bad, or maybe it doesn't matter. But I think one criticism that I actually do think has a lot of merit is at the moment, most people don't really spend Bitcoin. So most people, maybe that's not you and me, but most people that know about Bitcoin, they might have bought a few and just to keep it, and with the idea of saving it for 5 years, 10 years, and then it will be worth much more. And so if that's the case, and there might be a good investment case for that. But if that's the case, it's not really a currency, right? It's like it's an asset. It's a speculative thing, and I think it's fair to say that Bitcoin has yet to develop into a real global currency, into an internet currency, or and I think that's fair.
So one of the great illustrations in the film, there were two actually that caught my eye the most. Was one, the high-fiving graphic between the bank and the Federal Reserve. I laughed at that. I really enjoyed it. A little high-five of the institutions. But the other one was actually like more of a metaphor, more of an illustration drawing from history. You talked about how early automobiles had flagmen who actually had to go out and run out before the vehicle and warn people of the coming dangerous automobile innovation. And you obviously made the comparison there to Bitcoin being, a little bit feared, a little bit misunderstood, but I'm wondering if you could kind of explain that again to listeners who maybe haven't seen it yet, just to kind of entice them. It's a fascinating little snippet from history.
Yeah, I agree. That's one of my favorite parts as well. It's kind of like right in the middle of the film. So we talk about money and in the history of banks and things like that, and then how to get into that Bitcoin chapter. So there's like a little 5-minute segment which we call innovation, and I believe it opens with a quote saying that, oh, the only useful things that banks have ever invented was the ATM machine, or something like that. It's a quote by the former Fed chairman, saying that, oh, this industry is traditionally not very innovative. But the point here that you just described is new technologies are always like ridiculed, laughed at, or people who are in power, people who stand to lose most from that new technology, are always trying to break it, to slow it down, to flag it down. And the automobile is just so perfect because it was literally flagged down by a flagman, and it was slowed down literally because cars were not allowed to go faster than 4 miles an hour. So the whole point of an automobile was like kind of taken away. And looking at the internet at the beginning was only about child pornography and all these internet viruses, right? Nobody could see, or some people who criticized it couldn't see the benefits from it. And I think we see the same thing with Bitcoin, and it will be an interesting battle how it will turn out, right?
Absolutely interesting. Continue. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's fine. So it sounds like you're crafting a narrative with this film, and I really like this idea that you explain the history and then have a section in the middle that sort of pivots you into that next chapter. What do you think the role of education is when it comes to the adoption of this technology? And furthermore, do you think that people are ever really going to care how their money works?
Yeah. So the first comment. Well, I obviously think education is super important, and my way to do it is to make a film, and I hope that maybe one day the film will get on Netflix. Hopefully next week will be on iTunes and Amazon. So I hope a lot of new people that will not listen to your podcast and not buy a Bitcoin book, but maybe they'll find the movie. The second question. I don't know. What do you think? What's your take on that?
I'm often worried at the fact that people are so complacent, and I'm really hoping that films like this get exposure to ideas that people wouldn't have otherwise seen, and I think that's one of the reasons why filmmaking is such a powerful technology. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in filmmaking and what brought you to this specific art?
Mm-hmm. Jumping back to what you just said, I fully agree with you. Maybe on top of that, things like the Euro crisis in Greece, right, where people suddenly can't access their money, or some other scam going on with the next investment bank paying $1 billion in penalties for doing some shady scheme. I think all this helps a little, but you're probably right. I mean, people take money for granted. So yeah. Let's see. But in terms of my background, so I've been actually in the media industry for 12 years, I think now, buying and selling documentaries. So I'm the guy who basically takes 10 documentaries to Netflix or to Deutsche Telekom, or clients all around the world, and try to sell them or try to license them documentaries. And so this is actually the first one that I create myself. So after working with filmmakers for 10 years on the business side, this is the first time I'm the creative person behind it. But obviously we've had a team of highly experienced people who help me in the editing room and help me with shooting the interviews and things like that.
That's really cool. It's really exciting to kind of create it for the first time. And actually, we kind of wanted to shift gears and ask you a little bit in detail about the filmmaking process for our listeners, if you'd be willing. So the first question, I guess, would be, what are kind of the first steps you take when you go to make a documentary? And how do you go just from zero to making a film happen? Maybe just start with the first few steps and kind of describe what that process really looked like, as in detail as you like, because I think we probably have a lot of people in our audience who are interested in creating things, interested in kind of expressing ideas like this through creative arts.
Good question. So I don't think there's one definitive answer or one cookbook, so to speak, but for me, and that might be very interesting for your audience, I think it was a very iterative process, like a startup, right? So I didn't go onto Kickstarter and say, this is my idea. No, I actually did, I think the Miami shoot, that was our first shoot. I did that one, possibly 2 shoots before I even, really started that project. So I had lots of material already. I knew there's a story there. Then we did a Kickstarter, and the Kickstarter was not to fully fund the film. It was never meant to be, but it maybe covers maybe 20% of the budget. But it kind of was another step, a proof of concept, right? So people are interested in the idea. Okay, people are willing to pre-buy the DVDs and things like that. And then, you film more, you spend a lot of money, a lot of time, and you work on it. And another like milestones for me was a film festival. So there were like submission date. Oh, we have to submit to this film festival on that date. So we have to get like a 30-minute version of the film ready, even though it's not perfect yet. And we kept working on it, and finally, after 2 years now almost, it's done. But I constructed it in a way, and that's maybe also a suggestion for everybody. Do not make a film that's like so dependent on the current day, or on the current exchange rate, or on the latest scandal, because by the time your film is out, on Netflix, let's say, it's going to be out there for 2 years, and so I designed the film in a way that it's still as attractive or as important in 2 years' time, right? So there's nothing too current about it.
Since you were just mentioning that you purchased and sold documentaries, what maybe are some documentaries you would recommend that really influenced you, or even that you just enjoyed that maybe not everyone has seen or heard about?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The one standout in recent time was Citizen4, the award-winning documentary. I mean, it's just so scary, and it's such an important point. And I'm just a beginner and a rookie in this game, but watching something like Citizen4, that's a film that can really change the world and change behaviors all around the world. And certainly there's a few others. I mean, the big one is, of course, the climate change one 10 years ago that Al Gore did, An Inconvenient Truth. Those kind of films do inspire me, because they do create a kind of a cultural change, and that's very inspiring.
So one of the things we like to talk about, and one of the things we're actually going to be talking about in our talk segment this time, is intellectual property, intellectual content, and copyright. So I noticed that you decided to distribute this film on BitTorrent. We'll talk about that in a bit. But how did you get through the process of actually acquiring the content and the permission to use the things that you did in the film?
Yeah, and that's a very tricky point. I've actually met other Bitcoin filmmakers who were a little bit not diligent enough with it. Just to give you an idea, I had a 4-second or 5-second snippet from CNBC, I believe it was, a Warren Buffett quote. And where Warren Buffett basically said, "Oh, Bitcoin is a mirage," right? That famous quote. But that 5 seconds would have cost me $2,000 to license the rights. So, and I mean, I spent a lot of money on it, but I can't spend $2,000 for 5 seconds, right? So what we did in this case, we still use that quote, but we use a picture of him and a written quote, right? But a lot of Bloomberg footage, a lot of C-SPAN footage. We need to get the proper paperwork, and it's very time-consuming, tedious work, and sometimes also quite expensive. So yeah, very tough. Fortunately, the Bitcoin crowd excuse me, was actually very helpful. So we have a lot of footage of Bitcoin ATMs and excuse me, and those kind of footage that we just got for free, right? Those startup Bitcoin startups, they want the exposure, so they sent me screenshots of their wallets and their software and all that. So that was easy. But yeah, overall, I think we spent probably $10,000 just on footage, right? Then you had another question. Oh, that was you were going to ask me about BitTorrent later. Yeah.
Well, I do have a follow-up, and sort of as you were describing it, something that I found interesting was that the people that wanted to actually grow were willing to give you their content and were very agreeable. The people that were just trying to defend their entrenched, sort of authority, they're the ones who were fighting you. I found that very interesting. But furthermore, I'm kind of curious. Wouldn't the quote, the example that you gave, does that not fall under the fair use clause?
So my co-director is a television professional for 20 years. He's won many awards, and we were discussing and debating this over and over and over again. And for example, if you make fun of a quote and you contextualize it or comment on it, you would probably get away with it. You're right. But in our case, it was really like an opening quote for a new chapter, so it wouldn't really work like that. And we have a little bit of Wall Street footage, right? Where we just need it to cover space when we talk about Wall Street, and so it's beautiful shots of Wall Street and this and this. So we're just using it as eye candy. So we can't claim fair use on that. But it's a very interesting topic, and I can assure you there's many people getting sued for not doing their homework. And to be fair though, some of this footage is being produced by professionals. They stand out in Wall Street and wait for the Lehman Brothers executives to leave with their boxes, right? And I mean, they have to get paid eventually. So I mean, it is a legitimate business to do footage sales. Yeah, well.
It's really fascinating to see how this is made, you know, because it's such a part of kind of the media we consume, as we see the images of Wall Street and everything. We never really wonder how it's made. And I guess one of the things I'd like to follow up on that question was, what are some of the other challenges, I guess, of making an independent film, of bootstrapping a project like this, and how did you find creative ways of overcoming them?
So number one challenge is money, obviously. I mean, you can nowadays, you guys know this, you could probably do a Bitcoin documentary for free, just with, you know, interviewing people on Google Hangouts, and completely fine. But that's not a television-ready product at the end of the day. So we spend maybe $80,000 to $100,000 in total, which is very expensive if you compare it to a low end, but it's also very cheap if you compare it to like a proper TV documentary that takes up 25 times as much sometimes. You know, some of the documentaries that I represent in the wildlife space are multi-million-dollar productions. So I mean, it's always, you know, you have to find your middle ground, and I can tell you I'm still struggling making back that money. So even though you could say, well, we're very successful, we've won awards, you know, everybody knows about our film, haven't even recovered 10% of the budget yet. So I mean, that is, I think, the main challenge. Other than that, maybe just like a little anecdote, it's so hard to find Bitcoin critics to be in front of the camera. So we had this one famous guy, what's his nickname is Professor Bitcoin or Bitcoin. Maybe you've heard of him. He's all over the news always, you know, like making fun of Bitcoin. So we've had an appointment booked with him, and then his lawyer in the last minute pulled out and said, "Oh no, my lawyers, you know, advised me not to make a television documentary with you guys." So it's hard. It's hard to find those critics, and that's why it's hard to do a completely balanced view. But I mean, how do you balance something? I mean, my job is to tell the truth and to tell how does Bitcoin work and how doesn't it work, and things like that. And people make up their own minds whether they want to, you know, try it out or not.
And since it's about Bitcoin, I would assume a lot of the reception has been shaky because people are biased one way or the other toward Bitcoin. And how is that shown in the criticism of your work? Is it, or is shown as, you know, a documentary itself, not necessarily being about Bitcoin? You mentioned earlier the Al Gore film. If someone was, you know, someone didn't believe in global warming, they're going to say they're going to have a negative review regardless of how the film was made. Curious to see how that kind of works out for this movie.
Yeah, it's still a bit early for me because at the moment our audience is Bitcoiners, right? People that know about our film, and they talk about it within the Bitcoin circles. But I am getting tweets and emails from people who say, "Oh, I finally showed this film to my girlfriend or to my colleagues, and they finally get it." So that is my hope, and that was always the goal, not to make a film for you or for me, to make a film for our friends and our colleagues who still don't understand what this Bitcoin thing is about. And yeah, hopefully that will work.
So we have a question from the audience, and I think this is a reasonable follow-up to what Tony just asked. And this question comes from Jim Linden. And do you think that there are industries or people working actively against Bitcoin or possibly getting paid to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the astounding facts that I learned making this film is there's 5 lobbyists for every single Congress member for the financial industry, and I mean, they have to protect their turf and their, you know, sources of profits, and Bitcoin is one of those few threats for them. And I think there was even a report that MasterCard.
All right, I think we lost our guest right now due to a connection problem, so give us 1 second. Let's try to get him back on the line. So far, this interview's been going great, so everyone that's watching live,
you know, it's entirely possible that, you know, the powers that be have cut him off because they don't want him answering that question.
This is true. This is very true.
MasterCard caught on, didn't they?
Yeah, it was MasterCard. Yeah.
It seems too obvious, though. I mean, I would so obviously suspect that. It's really strange. I'm going to be reaching out to Torsten here, and we'll continue the discussion in the meantime. What do y'all think of this question?
You know, personally, I've seen it. I know for a fact, you know, if there's someone like Torsten who is, out of the kindness of his own heart, basically working to produce this film, then there absolutely have to be people that are getting paid to do things either for or against it. And, you know, as we know in the industry, you know, we have jobs in the industry, you know, jobs relating to Bitcoin and the blockchain-related startups. There absolutely has to be people, part of the entrenched majorities, that are just being paid to prevent this from succeeding. And that's just the unfortunate reality.
I saw some movement. Are you back? Oh, it appears there's audio issues. We can't hear you, but we can see you.
Yes, sorry, I just
go.
unmuted myself.
It's very unfortunate that we lost you right in the middle of the answering of that question. So
Okay, I think I'm back.
Good, yes, we've got you. So I was just saying that it was very unfortunate that we lost you in the middle of that question in particular. So if you would, go ahead and resume.
Yeah, so there was this report that MasterCard has two lobbyists just to lobby against Bitcoin a year ago or so. Not sure whether that one is particularly true, but I'm absolutely sure that there's people working against Bitcoin at the moment. The lobby groups are just too powerful. The banks are just too rich and have too much money and too much political and regulatory capture. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So, Torsten, I was going to ask you, what kind of success have you seen for the documentary so far? Obviously, we have some opposition to Bitcoin, but it seems like, challenges notwithstanding, the film's done quite well so far at film festivals and other events with a lot of Bitcoiners. Can you tell us a little bit about that, about the experience of promoting the film and the experience of the reception you've received?
Yeah, I'm very, very proud of the film festivals and the awards. Freedom Fest was our world premiere, and we won Best International Documentary and Best Libertarian Themes. So we're very proud of that. We've seen a very nice pickup in the Bitcoin crowd, and if you Google our name, you see Cointelegraph and all these articles. So we're quite pleased with that. I'm a little bit, let's say, disappointed still that we haven't really reached outside the Bitcoin crowd yet. And I think it will take time because people will tell their friends and then their friends. So I'm hoping that maybe the libertarian subculture, if you will pick up on the film a little bit more. And eventually, who knows, you know, maybe we will get a bit more traction on iTunes, on Amazon, once we are on those bigger platforms as well.
What steps do you have in mind, I guess, to kind of get outside of the libertarian, Bitcoiner, decentralization kind of sphere with this? Do you have any kind of steps in mind, or do you have you really kind of want to focus on building the solid base here and then maybe try with future efforts in other spaces?
Well, it is the first time, so I'm learning every day, and maybe some of your listeners have some good ideas or press contacts or whatever ideas. I mean, part of it is obviously my job is to license the film to the Netflixes and the television channels all around the world, and that's kind of my background. So I am confident that I will get the film out there to at least some of my clients. But who knows? I honestly don't know.
And since you're claiming this is kind of your first project, or I don't know if it was your first, but this is a project, and it's also involving a separate part of your life. What exactly are your future projects? Are they also going to be documentaries? What are you looking toward next? Does it have anything to do with the tech space or something completely different?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot, but I don't have an answer yet. So it's still too early days. I have to recoup the production budget, at least parts of it, and then think about the next steps. I would love to make a similar film again in the tech space because it's just something I'm passionate about. I'm a techie, I like startups, but who knows? It might be something else. Maybe you guys have a good idea. Maybe it's the Bitcoin 2.0 applications that are coming out in the next couple of days that are super, super sexy. I don't know.
So you're talking a lot about recouping your costs, and you said that you've only been able to recover so far about 10%. And you're talking about licensing to the Netflixes, to the TV stations, hopefully. Is that your sole source of revenue? Because I see you're also sort of you've chosen to distribute on BitTorrent. So I'd like to unwrap why you made the decision to do that. And then further, are there other mechanisms? Like, do you have a Bitcoin donation address that our listeners can donate to?
Yeah. So first, at the moment, yes, we only do pay VOD exploitation in the technical terms. So we are on Vimeo on demand. We are on the Protocol TV, where you can download or stream the film for Bitcoins. And we are on BitTorrent. But we are on BitTorrent Bundles, which is the pay service on BitTorrent. So it is a, I think, $7 download for the film plus a lot of bonus materials. So it's not, we haven't actively encouraged piracy or the torrenting of the film. However, obviously I do know that given the crowd and given our culture, that happens. I do hope that some of those donations end up in our wallet, but I haven't seen much for it. I've seen a few people trying to put up the entire film on YouTube, which I will flag, and this is at the moment obviously counterproductive to us making at least part of the production budgets back. So yeah, so that's happening at the moment. Next step this week and next week is Amazon and iTunes, and then the next step is subscription VOD services like Netflix or television channels.
So Torsten, obviously you're making the film available for Bitcoin. I think on the protocol.tv is one of the sources for that, and you're using BitTorrent as well. What do you see as kind of the role of these technologies, of these decentralized and distributed technologies, in the future of kind of content production and distribution? As a distributor yourself, do you think Bitcoin has a role in that?
Yeah, I love what the guys at the Protocol TV are doing, and they're super sharp, and they're like every little tweet or problem they work right on it, and it's just awesome to work with a small agile company like that. And similarly, Streamium.io, we did a little test with them as well. Small company in that space. I'm very hopeful, and I'm a technologist myself, and I like those kind of platforms. But I will say it's damn hard to create content platforms or to replicate a Netflix, right? It takes 15 years and hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising budget. So it's tough, very, very tough. So I think at the moment the place for Bitcoin in that industry is just as a payment mechanism on some of these services. Maybe Vimeo will accept it, maybe Amazon will accept it, but not really in the sense that you're thinking of, like a decentralized way to distribute content. Don't see it happening so soon, unfortunately.
Well, with that said, and you just went into a few different places viewers can see the movie. If there's any additional platforms that you forgot to mention, also there is a special for people that are listening to this, a promo code, and we wanted to give that out so you can go in with that. And how can our listeners find you and follow what you're doing and everything about the project online?
Yeah, first and foremost, so thanks for having us, and I'm talking about the film, so that's obviously a great platform for me to reach out to people. And as a little reward, we have a promo code for your listeners, and please put it on in the show notes. It's vimeo.com, and then you just search for Bitcoin, and our film will show up. And when you rent or buy the film, there's a 20% discount code by just typing in DECENTRALIZE, and it's all caps. Yeah, decentralize. Yeah, no need to spell it, I guess.
Fantastic.
And other maybe sorry, one more thing. And another thing is, we are independent filmmakers, and anything really helps. So I'm not asking for donations or anything, but if you can just give us a review on IMDb, or like a thumbs up, or like a little share, or a little like, or a little, Facebook, wherever you are, a tweet or whatever it is, it really helps us, because the Netflixes of these worlds, they are looking at. Does this film really have an audience? Is there really a story here? Do people care about this subject? And if I make a film that has 100 tweets and 10,000 followers, it will get taken more seriously than if I made a film about some topic that nobody cares about.
Well, Torsten, I think that this, I speak for all of us when I say that I think you've done a great thing for the overall Bitcoin community. Hopefully there will be many people educated by the film that you've produced. And we really appreciate you being able to join us on the show. And I think that personally, this may be one of the most seminal moments in deciding what the future of content distribution on the web looks like. So thank you again for joining us, Torsten.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, all of you.
So what is it that you learned in the process of making this film? Was there any surprises that you learned about Bitcoin or the ecosystem in general?
Yeah, a few things. So, I mean, the history of money wasn't really my area of expertise. So I did learn a lot researching that particular part of the story. But in terms of Bitcoin, what I was surprised about, in the beginning, people talk about those libertarian ideas and how freedom is so important and all these things. And in the beginning, I thought that's kind of bullshit, right? I thought that's it doesn't matter. It's a technology and it's money. And the more I kind of got into this space and talked to more and more people, Roger Ver is a good example. The more I realized how bad an idea it is to have governments or banks in control of our money. So this libertarian or that freedom aspect of it actually does make a lot of sense to me. So that's something I changed my mind about.
So maybe for our listeners who haven't seen the movie yet, and we definitely recommend it, or I would, having seen it, could you explain a little bit sort of why you think the libertarian critique of...
Today we're joined by Torsten Hoffman, who is the producer and director of the new award-winning documentary Bitcoin, The End of Money as We Know It. Torsten, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
All right, so first things first, what made you decide to make this film?
Well, Bitcoin is a complex topic, and it's hard to get the message across and the whole thing across in just one article that people might read in the New York Times. So I think it's a perfect topic for a TV documentary, and we ended up doing it in 60 minutes. So it's basically a 60-minute crash course into money and Bitcoin.
So, Torsten, this is essentially not just a documentary about Bitcoin, but also about monetary history. How did you decide to kind of approach it this way to take on this topic particularly?
Yeah, that changed. So I wanted to make a film about Bitcoin, but I then, starting to write it, realized that we can't just jump right in. We would lose people. So we just had to start. It was actually first invented or first came about. It was really about people agreeing that this paper had value because somebody else would exchange it and agree to the person that issues this can be trusted, so therefore his paper has value. And I think that is particularly important if you then later look into Bitcoin and how value is created.
And to further that a little bit, since the documentary is a lot about monetary history and about Bitcoin, obviously, what sources or experts, off screen or on screen, did you speak with or consult with to kind of guide where you were going with this?
So many different things. So I mean, I have a big bookshelf behind me, and I kind of studied finance and MBA as well. But we had many top experts on camera and off camera. So economists like Jeffrey Tucker, Roger Ver, and all these kind of Bitcoin gurus, of course. But also some skeptics. And I think, or I hope at least, that this is not too much of a fanboy film. I hope it's not like too one-sided. All the way in the beginning with the history of money, the gold coins, the governments that started to collect taxes and clip off those gold coins and things like that. Because only then, or even inflation. I mean, that's a very important one, obviously, for Bitcoin. So even if people know what the problem is with our fiat money, then they kind of get what the difference is in Bitcoin. So I think that was, a learning process for me along the way. And we spent about half of the film talking about money and banks and finance, and the other half about Bitcoin.
One of the things that we always like to ask about guests that are on have something to do with a project directly involving the Bitcoin blockchain is, how did you first discover Bitcoin?
So like many people, I heard about it 2 or 3 times and dismissed it and just kind of shrugged it off and laughed at it. But once I studied a bit more, I think only an hour maybe, it completely caught me. And maybe you guys changed your careers or started a podcast, or some people write a book or blog, and for me it was making a film about it. So similar to many others I think you've probably had on the show.
If maybe central banking has some merit, why you think Bitcoin sort of plays a role in that change in monetary history. A little teaser kind of the thrust of the movie, and especially toward monetary theory and history.
Yeah, a few things come to mind. So I think most people don't realize that the Fed is actually not a government agency or like a government department. It's owned by private banks, and that is one thing, and maybe that's bad enough. But if you realize that our money today is created by debt, so that means if the U.S. government goes much more into debt, they sell those bonds. The same banks that own the Fed benefit from having more debt. So basically the whole system is kind of set up to create more and more money, and that of course turns into inflation down the road. So I think that is something we try to have a punchy little paragraph or chapter in our film about, like those charts of how inflation affects money. So that would be one. Another one, let me think. Yeah, like even the idea of how paper money